2013 Camaro. A few months back I did a video on replacing the alternator. It was on another Camaro, it wasn't this one. The alternator's down here, and before I started on the alternator, I showed disconnecting the power source from the B positive cable going to the battery at this point here. And I got some negative feedback on that, and I totally get it. But I want everybody to understand what's going on whenever you disconnect power at this point. And I've been disconnecting power at this point for years, depending on the make and model. Sometimes it's just as easy to disconnect the battery, sometimes it's not. Now, in this particular car, I'm going to show you why this was an option for me. And just to show you, on this car, trunk. Let me get this box out of here. Well, you know what? No, I want you to see all this. Because the first thing you got to do to disconnect the battery is pull everything out of your trunk. Then you got this board that you've got to pull up. You got to pull this liner out. Then you got to pull this board up. Then you got to pull the spare tire out of the trunk. The battery is literally under the spare tire. And I'm not going to go ahead and go through all that. But this just goes to show you why I made the decision to disconnect it where I did. This is a pain for something that is so much easier to do as long as you understand the risk and what's going on. So let me throw this stuff back in, because that's the next step. Once you're done with the alternator, you get to put everything back together back here in the trunk. So now that that's out of the way, let's take a quick look at the diagram. Okay, here's the diagram. So here's the battery right here. Here's the positive battery cable where it's connected to the battery. You see this dotted line comes down, connects here at X1, which is a junction box at the battery. And then it comes on down to what they call the battery cable junction box, which is this right here. Here's the cable. It's a nice big fat cable. Has to be this big because of the length of run that it has. Typically, if the battery was under the hood, they'd be able to go with a lot smaller size cable. But since this has to run all the way to the battery, you got to go bigger. So this is the point that I disconnected this. And effectively, what you're doing, someone made a good point that, you know, they disconnected it there. Well, the car still had power. Well, yes, it is. The only thing you're disconnecting at this point is you're disconnecting power from the alternator and the starter. And that needs to be made clear. You don't want to disconnect this and then think that you have just killed power to the entire car. That is not the case. You see these two wires here, you know, you got two fusible links, a 60 amp and a 100 amp, that's still connected, and you've got two other wires coming off of this junction box at the battery, still feeding power to the car. Now this does kill power to this box here. This underhood fuse box will not have power if you disconnect this point here. So whenever you disconnect, and we're going to do that here in just a second, I'm going to disconnect this and I'm going to show you with a meter what does and doesn't have power. When you disconnect it right here, you are safe disconnecting the generator cable or the starter cable. You're not going to have to worry about arcing either one of those to a ground and getting a surprise. You do, however, have to worry about arcing the main cable here to ground. Now the nice thing about it is most all this stuff is painted. There's really nothing that this cable is able to swing over and hit. And since you're over here on the other side of the engine bay working on the alternator, you don't really run much of a risk of slapping that around, you know, jostling around and hitting it and having it run, you know, move over and hit something. So just be aware that if you do disconnect right here, be aware you do have power still connected to various parts of the car. So you don't want to be pulling your engine out and having this disconnected only. You want to go to the back and you want to disconnect the negative side of the battery, which is another topic that we'll talk about, because it is no different. If I was to disconnect at this point right here and arc this cable to ground, it is no different than people that disconnect the positive side of their battery, and people do it every single day. I've seen it hundreds of times. Most of the time they get lucky. They don't arc the wrench to the body or another ground. But people that disconnect the positive side of their battery run the risk of, when the wrench or ratchet or whatever you're using swings over to loosen the nut or bolt on the battery clamp terminal, you run the risk of arcing that wrench. I have done that. I've done that whenever I was a kid. I didn't know any better. I arced the wrench. I still have the wrench to this day with a big chunk molted, with the molted end on it. And I got a surprise. I couldn't believe how quick that thing arced and melted that chunk of metal out of that. It was a Craftsman wrench. So you run the same risk whether you disconnect it at the positive point of the battery or right here. There is really no difference. You just need to be aware. The safest way, if you are unsure of yourself or you're not 100% familiar with the system, you're better off going through the time, take everything out of the trunk, take the spare tire out, and disconnect the negative side of the battery. You want to disconnect anytime you disconnect the battery, you disconnect the negative side first. If you're putting a battery in, you connect the positive side first, then you connect the negative side. In this case, I was perfectly comfortable, and like I said, I've done it at least 100 times where I've disconnected power here. I have never had a problem. It's just a time saver for me. I don't have to open the trunk up, don't have to pull stuff out of the trunk, don't have to disconnect anything at the trunk. One bolt, and that's disconnected. And I'm safe to either replace a starter or a generator. So I'm going to disconnect this real quick, and we're going to do some measuring. Let me find a place to put this. It's kind of windy out right now. Oh, you know what? Show you this other print, what's going on here. So here's the actual generator. Here's your B positive terminal. The B positive is your big fat terminal that comes usually straight from the battery, straight to the generator. When the generator's charging, car's running, generator's charging, that's what goes straight to the battery to not only charge the battery up, but everything else in the car is literally being ran off of the generator. The battery technically only has 2 or 3 jobs. The very first and most important is to start the vehicle. But it's also a backup in case the alternator fails. You have however much time the battery is able to carry the load until the car shuts down. It also kind of acts as a kind of a shock absorber for electrical spikes throughout the system. The battery will kind of soak that up, and it creates a more smooth DC voltage for the entire electrical system. But its number one job is to start the vehicle. And so once it's running, the alternator is what's supplying all the power for everything. Now, when you disconnect, here's that point. This right here is this point right here. When you disconnect this point right here, there's the starter. So you're disconnecting the starter you're disconnecting the alternator. You can safely replace either one of those with the big fat wire pulled away from this junction box. So let's see what we're going to have to do here to prevent this thing from blowing away. And I'll show you how easy it is to do this. I'm going to set the camera up. And I get, a lot of people freak out over this stuff, and I guess I've just been doing it so long that I don't really worry too much about it anymore. Okay, one big nut. This is obviously this is where you would connect your positive jumper cable. Okay, I'm going to pull up on this wire here. Now, I usually just take this and leave it right there. What you're looking at is just an isolated stud. This fat cable here, which is still connected to the battery, you can just leave sitting right there. This right here can touch anything. There's no voltage on this cable here. This is the cable that runs to the starter and the generator. So that cable there, I don't know if you can see it. There's actually two cables. That's actually spliced on that connector. That's two cables. There's the splice. The way they have this drawn, it looked like it'd actually be three separate connections, but the starter and the alternator wire are actually spliced together on one terminal, and so you only have two terminals going there. But what the terminal that I've got laying off to the side, it's got both the starter wire and the alternator wire. And just to prove that there is no electricity, no voltage on that, let's take our meter. Hopefully you can see that. I don't know. And by the way, this is where you would connect your negative battery cable. If you had to jump start this vehicle, negative at this point right here, positive right here. So I'm going to take my negative meter lead, connect it up right there, and we're going to, I've got it on DC voltage. We're going to connect it here. We have our 12 volts battery voltage, 12.6 volts. So you do not want to arc this. Now if you're not worried about it, you could tape that, put a plastic bag around it, or even a rag, whatever. I just leave it right there. I know that's live battery power, so I don't mess with it. If I was in this area working and there was a likelihood that I would be able to arc this on something, I would definitely disconnect it at the battery. But like right now, if I needed to replace the generator or alternator or the starter, I have no problems disconnecting right here and replacing them at that point. Now, I'm connected right here to the cable that runs down to the generator and the cable that runs straight down to the starter. Nothing. That's 0.18, that's just residual voltage. That's basically no voltage at all. So you're perfectly safe doing it this way, as long as you understand this wire is live. And there are certain parts of the electrical system that is still powered up, and you just need to be aware of that. But you can see how much quicker it is to disconnect right here, and how quick it is to hook it right back up. I mean, it's just a big time saver for me. Now, I feel comfortable doing it just be aware of what you're doing here. At least have a basic understanding of the fact that this is still a live wire. The safest way to do it is, without a doubt, disconnecting the negative side of the battery at the trunk. But to do that, you're taking the spare tire out. Obviously, that's not that big of a deal, but it'll save you 5 minutes. So I'm all about saving time. Anyway, enough going on about this video. I just wanted to kind of show exactly what's going on. There's a lot of cars that has a setup like this. If you have the battery in the trunk, they generally, every car I've ever dealt with has a positive connection under the hood. And the main reason for that is to jump start the vehicle. You know, if you're in a parking lot at Target and your battery's dead, you know, most people know that, okay, you pop the hood and you hook jumper cables up and you jump start the vehicle. This is where you're going to hook that positive cable to. And then there's generally going to be a ground somewhere under the hood that you're going to be able to connect to. On this car, this is it, as far as the ground. So that's what this is all about. Anyway, that's probably about all I needed to say. So again, if you're uncomfortable doing it that way, then by all means, disconnect the battery. Not a problem. I mean, it probably is a better way to do it. It's definitely a safer way, but as long as you're aware of what's going on, you can safely do it right here without a problem. And just make your life a little bit easier. With that, I'm out. You guys take care.